wife flirted with her ex in front of me on her birthday, so I got up to. When my fiancé was injured, it felt as though the ground beneath me crumbled. The accident was a whirlwind of fear and urgency, and I remember feeling almost numb as we rushed to the hospital. The hours we waited to hear about his condition felt like days, and when the doctors finally informed us that he'd need surgery, everything started moving in a blur of signing forms, consoling each other, and silently fearing what might happen next. Just 2 days later, he went under the knife, and I knew life as I'd known it was about to change indefinitely. Since that day, I have been his shadow, his support, his caregiver, and every bit of what he might need at any given moment. The nurses and doctors briefed me on his recovery needs, how he'd be in pain, and what I'd have to watch for in terms of complications. They gave instructions on medications, dosages, and dietary requirements, but nothing could truly prepare me for the weight of this new role. Once we got him home, I quickly realized I was now responsible for everything. The smallest tasks he used to handle, getting himself a glass of water, walking the dog, even doing a load of laundry, were now entirely up to me. It was a kind of responsibility I had never anticipated shouldering so young. I'm only 21, and the sudden leap into what felt like the role of a wife, mother, and nurse combined was overwhelming. But this was my reality, and there was no room to back down or crumble under pressure. He needed me, and I loved him, so I became whatever he needed. Each day felt like a marathon of tasks, and each night was a test of my endurance. From cooking meals, often ones he'd specifically request or need for his recovery, to handling our pets and trying to keep the household somewhat orderly, I did everything. When he needed to go to the bathroom, I helped him there, even if it was in the middle of the night. I stayed by his side as he leaned on me for support, often spending hours helping him move from his bed to a chair or simply making sure he was comfortable. And yet, all of this was happening while I worked remotely. I'd shuffle back and forth between him and my desk, constantly switching gears. The days were long and the nights longer, with barely a chance to breathe. I wasn't sleeping well. Any rustle from his side of the bed would wake me up, and I'd spring to his aid, ready for whatever he needed. I knew this would be a difficult period, but I was determined to get through it. At first, he was appreciative. With the help of his strong pain medication, he was often subdued and more emotionally open than usual. He would thank me for every little thing I did, showering me with words of gratitude and affection. He told me that he didn't know what he would do without me, that he was so lucky to have me by his side. Each time he thanked me, it felt like a small balm on the exhaustion that clung to me. His love and appreciation helped me keep going, to find the strength to take on another day, no matter how tired I felt. But everything changed as he started to wean off the painkillers. As his medication dosage decreased, so did his appreciation. The pain seemed to take over him completely, overshadowing the gratitude he'd once expressed. Suddenly, every meal I prepared was wrong. The food was too hot or too cold, too bland or too spicy, or simply not what he wanted. His frustration poured out in waves, and I found myself the target of his growing irritation. He would snap at me for things I couldn't control, like his own discomfort or the position of his pillow. I would rush to his side when he called, only to be met with a dismissive, "Never mind," or a "Leave me alone," followed by a resentful glare. And if he was in pain, he expected me to fix it, as if I had some hidden power to make everything better. After weeks of sleepless nights and constant caregiving, the exhaustion became suffocating. I felt like I was disappearing, my own needs fading into the background, swallowed by his demands and frustrations. I missed my friends and family, missed being able to call them just to chat, missed seeing them in person. I felt completely isolated, unable to even have a 10-minute phone call without hearing him summon me or complain. The weight of his anger and my solitude started pressing down on me until it was almost unbearable. One night, after he'd yelled at me yet again for bringing him the wrong thing, I reached a breaking. I waited until he'd finally drifted off to sleep, and then I called his mother. I'd been keeping everything to myself, not wanting to worry anyone, but I couldn't bear it any longer. I needed to talk to someone, to feel some support from someone who understood. As soon as she answered, I felt the floodgates open, and I started crying before I could even explain. 15 minutes of pent-up frustration poured out, and she listened patiently, offering words of comfort and understanding. Her kindness and validation felt like a lifeline. Hearing everything I was going through, she grew furious, not at me, but at her son. She told me that I was doing more than any person should be expected to do, and that his treatment of me was unacceptable. After we hung up, she confronted him, her anger palpable even through the closed door. I heard him stammering, struggling to defend himself, but mostly just grasping for excuses. I could tell he was taken aback, probably realizing for the first time that his mother, his biggest supporter, wasn't going to tolerate his behavior. The following day, his mother flew up to stay with him and insisted I take some time away. She arranged for me to stay in a nearby hotel, a far more comfortable space than our chaotic home. When I left, he was furious. He accused me of betraying him, of not being there for him in sickness and in health. His words stung, and I could feel my heart breaking as he yelled that I wasn't cut out to be his wife if I couldn't even stick by him now. I told him I loved, that I was sorry for leaving, but he brushed it off, shouting that his mom would do a better job than I ever could. Now, sitting alone in a hotel room that feels almost too luxurious, I feel torn between guilt and relief. Part of me wonders if I failed him by stepping back, if I should have pushed through, even though I knew I couldn't take it anymore. But another part of me feels lighter, free from the constant demands and the unending exhaustion, even if just for a moment. It's been 2 weeks since he started weaning off the strong painkillers. His doctors had carefully managed the process, knowing his history with substance abuse, so there wasn't a sudden drop. Yet, even with professional guidance, the withdrawal was impacting him emotionally and mentally, and I was paying the price. His mood swings were brutal, his anger sharp and directed at me. For every bit of love and support I had once felt, I was now met with resentment and harsh words. I try to remind myself that he's going through a lot, and that his pain is clouding his judgment, but my compassion has its limits, and I can feel myself reaching them. When his mother called and said she'd take him back to their hometown once flights were available, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. In the meantime, I've stayed at this hotel, waiting for the storm to settle. I'll go see him in a week, but I'm not sure what I'll say or what I'll feel when I see him. Returning to the house felt surreal. After the brief reprieve in the hotel, stepping back into that space was like stepping into a different reality, one that I had only started to understand while away. My mother-in-law had done her best to tidy up and make the house feel welcoming, but the air was thick with an uneasy tension that lingered like an uninvited guest. Every corner, every item, every room held a memory, and the weight of it all was almost suffocating. It felt like stepping back into a life I was slowly realizing I might not want any. The silence was broken only when my fiancé greeted. His words landed heavily, devoid of warmth or welcome. "I'm glad you're back. Can you make me a snack?" he asked, as if I had simply been out on an errand and was back to fulfill my role as his caregiver. There was no apology for the way he had spoken to me before I left. No hint of accountability. It was just a blunt request, or rather a demand. My heart sank. I'd hoped, foolishly perhaps, for some acknowledgement of everything I'd been through, of the patience and care I had shown him. But that small hope was dashed instantly, replaced by the familiar exhaustion and sadness I had felt during his recovery. His behavior didn't improve as the days wore on. If anything, it worsened, and the familiar ache of loneliness began to resettle in my chest. He spoke to me only when he needed something, as though my presence was a utility, something to be used rather than appreciated. The flowers, the gratitude, the little moments of kindness I'd clung to when his friends visited had been fleeting, a performance of sorts. Now, back to reality, he reverted to his familiar patterns. It hurt, but this time, I felt a flicker of something different within me, a determination to move beyond it. It was then that he informed me, with only a 2-hour warning, that friends were coming to stay for the weekend. He hadn't asked, hadn't thought to check if I was up for it, and had simply expected me to adapt, to accommodate. I found myself sighing in resignation as I prepared the guest room, a routine so ingrained I barely questioned it. His friends arrived, and for a brief moment he transformed back into the person I'd once fallen in love with. He brought me flowers, got out of bed daily, and took me out. I even noticed that he'd loosened his grip on my time, letting me call my family without his usual scrutiny. But when his friends left, the man I loved disappeared with them, and in his place was the same resentful partner I'd grown so used to. Once again, he took to bed, and his demands filled the air around me. I knew then that I couldn't do this forever. I knew I needed to find a way out, a way to reclaim the life that I'd somehow lost along the way. It terrified me, the thought of leaving him, the idea of standing in front of him, face to face, and explaining that I was no longer willing to be the silent support to his unending demands felt like an impossible task. But, as fate would have it, he was planning to leave the country for a month in April, and that gave me the space I needed to think. My sister lived abroad, and I started planning a trip to visit her during that month. It wasn't easy logistically, especially with the pets and all the details to manage, but it was a light at the end of this dark tunnel. The thought of seeing her, of feeling supported by someone who truly loved, kept me going through those long, exhausting days. It became my little secret, a quiet resolve that gave me strength every time he barked another command or ignored my existence. Amidst all of this, I found myself caught in yet another familial complication. When I confided in my mother that I was planning to return the engagement ring, hoping for her support, she responded coldly, "That's not what we do. We clean our messes." Her words stung more than I'd anticipated. I felt like a disappointment in her eyes, as though my choice to pursue a healthier life somehow reflected poorly on our family. Thankfully, my father's response was the opposite. He supported me without hesitation, offering a safe place and the comfort of unconditional love. It was a reminder that while I'd been seeking kindness and understanding from my fiancé, these qualities should come naturally from a partner, not just from a parent. I missed my mother-in-law's warmth, but I knew that I deserved that same kindness from my partner, not just from his family. Her love and understanding had been a lifeline during those rough days, but I couldn't build a marriage on borrowed support. My fiancé's mother had been more compassionate toward me than he ever had, and I began to see that I deserved someone who would support me the way she had. Slowly, I stopped forcing myself to find joy in his presence, and instead, I found strength in the realization that this wasn't the life I wanted. When I finally moved out, taking my pets and settling at my father's, it was a bittersweet relief. My pets adapted faster than I did, and I clung to their presence for comfort. My father's house, while familiar, felt strange after everything I'd been through, and I found myself in a strange limbo, suspended between relief and lingering guilt. I was searching for jobs closer to home, trying to carve out a new life, but a part of me still felt tethered to the past. It was hard to let go, hard to sever ties with someone who had been my whole world for so long. Leaving him felt like leaving a piece of myself behind. We'd been together since high school. He'd been there through my first big life events. So much of who I was, I felt, was shaped around him. I found myself second-guessing my decision at every turn, wondering if I was wrong for leaving, if I was selfish for seeking something different. But over time, I came to realize that by stepping away, I was doing what was best for both of us. I wasn't helping him by enabling his behavior, and I was only hurting myself by staying. When he left on his planned trip, I took that chance to retrieve my things from our shared home. It was a strange, somber process, walking through the rooms that had once held so many of our memories and gathering what was left of my old life. I organized my lease, settled the practical details, and finally felt a sense of closure. As I packed, I felt a strange peace, as though each item placed in a box was a step toward reclaiming myself. On his trip, he finally had a moment to reflect on his behavior. Perhaps it was the distance, or the company he was with, but he seemed to finally see what he had been ignoring for so long. He was disappointed in himself, he told me, ashamed of how he'd treated. For the first time, he took responsibility, and I could hear the sincerity in his voice. It wasn't an empty apology. It was filled with genuine self-awareness. Hearing him express this was a relief, a confirmation that maybe, deep down, he wasn't the person he'd become. I was also beginning therapy, navigating the complex feelings of loss, relief, and uncertainty. This was my first serious breakup, and the aftershock was real. It was a strange kind of mourning, grieving the future I'd once envisioned with him and the life I thought we'd share. Yet, I knew that this step was essential for both of us to grow. I had no resentment toward him. I was hurt, yes, disappointed, but I didn't hate him. There was a part of me that was sad to hear of his pain, that wanted to comfort him. But I knew better than to blur those boundaries. We spoke once a week, so he could see the pets and share updates about his progress. It was respectful, a gentle friendship, and I felt proud of us for creating a space where love and boundaries could coexist. Each week, I grew more accustomed to my independence. I was learning to enjoy the silence, to relish the small freedoms of being my own person. It was empowering, even if it sometimes felt lonely. And as I grew, I found myself needing his validation less. For the first time, I was able to focus on myself, to find comfort in my own company. I still haven't spoken to my mother. That conversation will happen, but only when I feel ready. I need her to understand that I'm no longer the person she can guilt into compromising my happiness to save face. I love her, but I won't let her fear of a broken home dictate my life. I am young, I am resilient, and I have a future ahead of me that holds more than just comfort. It holds possibility, love, and fulfillment. In the back of my mind, I knew that a final goodbye could come with consequences, but it was a fleeting thought, a nagging fear I dismissed, thinking the universe wouldn't hand me that level of irony. Yet here I am, staring down the reality I'd once dreaded. I am pregnant. The moment I saw the 2 pink lines, it felt as though my heart both stopped and raced at once. The full weight of my situation settled in, and I sat there in stunned silence, wondering how on earth I was going to navigate this new path. The thought of raising a child on my own had always terrified me, but I never imagined I'd be staring it in the face so soon. There's a raw kind of vulnerability that comes with realizing you're carrying life. I want to give this baby everything: love, security, stability. But as I sat there absorbing the news, I couldn't help but question how I'd manage it all alone. I've barely figured out how to take care of myself, let alone a child. My mind spun with doubts and worries, fears mingling with an undeniable sense of responsibility. My life has flipped in every conceivable way, and I am filled with both love for this little one growing inside me and a sense of overwhelm that borders on panic. Telling my ex was complicated. I didn't want him to think I expected anything from him, Nor did I want him to assume this pregnancy would change the dynamics between us. I carefully crafted my words, reassuring him that while he had the right to know and to be involved if he chose, this wouldn't alter the fact that we had separated. I was prepared for any reaction, but was taken aback when he responded with a level of determination I hadn't anticipated. He immediately declared that he was moving to my hometown and that he would be the best goddamn father you've ever seen. While part of me felt a flicker of hope at his newfound resolve, another part of me couldn't help but wonder if he was only doing this to win back my favor. Every gesture, every promise seemed like an echo of the past, a reminder of the highs and lows that had characterized our relationship. I wanted to believe him, but history kept tapping me on the shoulder, reminding me of the cycles we'd fallen into before. His words were easy to cling to, especially in these lonely and uncertain moments, but I knew I couldn't let my own hopes blur my judgment. Still, he tried. I'd receive texts checking in on my health, on our baby, little gifts showing up on my doorstep, flowers, thoughtful trinkets, even a massage certificate. And while each gesture warmed a small part of me, it also stirred that familiar fear of losing myself again. I couldn't allow this child to be a reason to slide back into the old roles we'd played. I was no longer interested in mothering him or enabling his dependency on me. This baby deserved parents who were whole individuals, not caught up in a cycle of dependence and frustration. I had to stay strong, hold my ground, and protect the newfound independence I was fighting so hard to keep. But it was harder than I'd anticipated. Then there was my father. I'd thought telling my ex would be the hardest part, but facing my dad with the news was something else entirely. It didn't matter that I was 21. Telling your father that you're expecting his grandchild, especially under these circumstances, was incredibly intimidating. I braced myself, half expecting disappointment or judgment. But his response was a quiet, supportive hug. He held me tightly, whispered that we would figure this out together, and in that moment, I felt a strength that I didn't know I had. He was my constant, my rock, and knowing that he was by my side filled me with a renewed sense of purpose. Unfortunately, things with my mother were far more complicated. Our relationship had always been rocky. I'd lived with my dad since I was a teenager, limiting my contact with her to avoid the emotional chaos she so often stirred up. After high school, I moved away with my ex for college, and she tried to follow, hoping to rebuild a connection. For a time, I'd hoped we could bridge the gap, that maybe we could form a new bond based on mutual respect and understanding. But I quickly realized that the same toxic patterns persisted. I found myself withdrawing again, keeping my distance for my own peace of mind. When my life took another turn and I ended up back in my hometown, I decided to live with my dad again. His house was full, though, and I knew I'd need a space of my own for the pregnancy. My mother offered me her guest house, and I accepted with the hope that this distance, on the property but not in the main house, would create enough of a boundary to keep things peaceful. I envisioned a quiet time of preparation, a place where I could focus on building a better life for my child without her usual interference, but I couldn't have been more wrong. From the first day, it became clear that my mother saw this as an opportunity to regain control. She would come by every evening after work, ostensibly to check on me, but her visits quickly turned into a daily intrusion. She would offer me an alcoholic drink without fail, almost as if to test my resolve. Every time I declined, her face would sour, and she'd stand outside my bedroom chain-smoking as if to remind me that this was her property, her rules. It was incredibly stressful. Her presence, her scrutiny, her little power plays made me feel small again, like a child under her thumb. And while I knew I should be grateful for the space, the stress of her constant hovering and disregard for my well-being was wearing me down. One evening, I finally spoke up, gently asking her not to offer me alcohol and explaining that the smell of smoke made me nauseous. Her reaction was immediate and furious. She yelled, telling me that I was ungrateful, that I could leave in the morning if I didn't like it. I was left shaken, feeling a deep sense of isolation. I had thought that being near her, in a separate space, could help us heal some of our old wounds. But instead, it felt like she was finding every opportunity to bait me into conflict. It was as if she needed to reassert her control, to remind me of my dependence on her, even though I was an adult preparing to bring a child into the world. So here I am, pregnant, grappling with a complicated relationship with my ex, and trying to navigate the emotional maze that is my mother. I am working long hours, preparing for motherhood, and doing my best to hold myself together. But the weight of it all is staggering. I want to be respectful, to keep peace for the sake of my baby, but I am beginning to realize that my own peace matters too. I am not just trying to survive these days. I am trying to create a life for my child that is filled with love and stability, not the chaos that seems to surround me. In my heart, I wish my mother could understand that. I wish she could see that I'm not rejecting her, but simply trying to give my child a healthy, safe start. I want this little one to know love without conditions, to feel valued and cherished in a way that doesn't come with strings attached. I am trying to give our family a chance at something better, and I wish she could meet me halfway. But I am learning day by day that sometimes people can only meet you where they are, not where you need them to be. It's hard to believe how much has changed. Life has taken me in every imaginable direction, but for the first time in what feels like forever, I'm in a place of true peace and content. Looking back on this journey, it's surreal to think about how much I've grown, how many versions of myself I've shed to become the person I am now. There were times when I felt like I'd never find my footing, like every step forward would be met with another obstacle. Yet, here I am, happy, grounded, and grateful for the life I've built. Several months ago, I started a new job. It felt like the universe finally threw me a lifeline, not just in terms of financial security, but as a path toward a fresh start. The position was challenging, yet aligned perfectly with my skills, and the pay was better than I'd imagined. I'd been saving up while staying at my mom's, but as soon as I had the stability of a steady paycheck, I moved out. The guest house arrangement had been stifling, and I knew I needed my own space, a sanctuary where I could truly begin the healing process. At work, I met a group of coworkers who quickly became much more than colleagues. They were vibrant, kind-hearted people who lived with an openness and enthusiasm I hadn't encountered in a long time. From my first day, I felt drawn to their energy, to the warmth and sincerity that defined their interaction. They invited me to outings, encouraged me to join their adventure, and soon I found myself surrounded by a new circle of friends who genuinely cared about. Their friendship was a balm to my weary heart, helping me see beyond the hurt and loss I'd carried for so long. Then came the miscarriage. Losing my baby in the second trimester was a pain unlike anything I'd ever known. It was a loss so deep, so raw, that there were days I couldn't fathom getting out of bed. I was consumed by an overwhelming sense of failure, as though my body had betrayed me in the most profound way. There was nothing anyone could say to alleviate that hurt, and I was haunted by the dreams of what might have been. Even now, I carry that ache with me. I think about my child daily, holding space for the love I'll never get to share with them. But I am stronger now, a little more each day, and the support of my friends has been essential in helping me find my way back to myself. My ex's reaction to the miscarriage was a storm of its own. He lashed out, claiming I'd taken his family from him, as though my body had somehow made that choice. He threatened to sue me for emotional distress, hurling accusations and blame as if that would soothe his own pain. It was a stark reminder of the person I'd walked away from, the volatility and resentment that had pushed me to seek a different life. While I understood he was hurting too, I couldn't allow his anger to consume me. I had to let go of his words and focus on healing. Amidst the loss and grief, something unexpected happened. I began seeing one of my new friends from work. He was a little older, and in many ways, he was everything I'd ever wanted, but had convinced myself I didn't deserve. Where my ex had been critical and dismissive, this man was gentle, considerate, and endlessly supportive. He'd cook meals for us, encourage me to follow my passions, and offer a listening ear whenever I needed to talk. He saw beauty and strength in me that I'd long forgotten, and through his kindness, I began to see those qualities in myself again. For the first time in years, I felt safe enough to be vulnerable, to share the pieces of myself that I'd hidden away. He didn't just tolerate my quirks and insecurities. He embraced them, creating a space where I could finally be myself without fear of judgment. Being with him was like rediscovering parts of myself that had been dormant for too long. I realized that love didn't have to be conditional or filled with unspoken resentment. I found myself wanting to be better, not because I felt inadequate, but because he inspired me to reach for the best version of myself. My friendships in this new relationship allowed me to reconnect with my passion. I began revisiting hobbies that I'd abandoned, immersing myself in creative projects, outdoor adventures, and moments of simple joy that had once seemed frivolous. Life started to feel vibrant again, filled with possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider while caught in my past relationship. I was reminded of who I'd been before, and of the strength that had always been within me, waiting for a chance to shine.